A successful black woman, fresh off a major business deal, was just trying to board her flight home. But the moment she reached the jetway, everything changed. A security officer singled her out without explanation. Within minutes, she was handcuffed in public, humiliated in front of stunned passengers. Phones recorded. Voices rose. But no one expected what would happen next, because just hours later, the CEO of the airline called her directly, with an apology that would rock the entire industry. What unfolded after that was something no one could have predicted, and it sparked a nationwide reckoning. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. But before we dive in, let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and if this story moves you. Don't forget to subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because what happened that day wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a mirror held up to a system too many still pretends doesn't exist. It begins, as these things so often do, not with a shout, but with a silence. The kind of silence that hums beneath the surface of polite society, the kind that wraps itself in TSA uniforms and smiles that don't quite reach the eyes. Danielle Johnson stood in the pre-dawn light of Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, her carry-on wheeled behind her like a shadow. She wore the kind of tailored navy suit that said executive without apology. She was not late, not frantic, not wide-eyed like the travelers around her. No, Danielle moved with the quiet authority of a woman who had spent years folding herself into spaces that were never built for her and learning how to own them anyway. She was on her way to Los Angeles, seat 2A, first class, booked under her name, Vice President of Global Brand Strategy, Delta Airlines. But to the outside world, to the eyes that never bothered to look deeper, she was a black woman traveling alone. That alone was enough to stir suspicion in a system built on the unspoken assumption that certain bodies don't belong where money, power, and comfort live. At Gate 34, families fussed over snacks, businessmen tapped away on laptops, and retirees clutched boarding passes with wrinkled hands. And in the middle of it all stood Danielle, sipping her black coffee, scrolling through presentation slides, not bothering anyone, not making noise. But silence doesn't protect you when the system has already made up its mind. She noticed him before he noticed her, Officer Daniels, white, mid-50s, the kind of man whose authority had never been questioned in his own life, and who mistook this unearned comfort for character. His eyes passed over the crowd like a lighthouse scanning the waves, until they locked on her. Not in recognition. In presumption. Danielle looked down at her phone again, pretending not to notice. But she felt the shift. She always did. It's the peculiar burden of being both visible and invisible at once, seen as threat, never as human. She took a breath and reminded herself, you are the vice president. You're not here to educate anyone today. Just get on the flight. Just go home. But that's the tragedy, isn't it? That even success, black success, has to tiptoe. As the boarding announcement crackled overhead, Danielle stood and moved toward the line. The silence around her didn't break, it tensed. She felt the weight of unseen eyes, the prickle on the back of her neck, and behind her, the slow approach of heavy shoes. "Ma'am," came the voice, firm, practiced, and falsely polite. Danielle turned. Officer Daniels looked at her like a man who'd already decided he was being lied to. "May I see your ID, please?" Her breath caught, not in fear, not yet, but in weariness. The kind of weariness her grandmother knew, her mother knew, and now she knew too. The unrelenting fatigue of having to explain yourself, again and again, to men who would never be asked to do the same. "Yes," she said, her voice cool. "Is there a problem?" Daniels hesitated, then smiled, a smile without warmth. "Just a routine check. But black folk know better. We always know better." Danielle handed him her ID. The name glinted beneath the terminal lights. Danielle A. Johnson. The photograph was flattering, the smile professional, the gaze direct. Officer Daniels looked at it longer than necessary, then back at her. "This is your bag, too?" She nodded. Mind if I take a quick look? The question wasn't a question. As he unzipped the leather flap of her briefcase, she stood silent, surrounded by people who had decided not to see. That was the first test, not of her paperwork, but of her patience. And beneath that, the real inspection began, not of a bag, but of a truth this country still refuses to unpack. That a black woman, even in a power suit, even with a corporate title, even with no raised voice, no crime, no threat, still walks through America with a target stitched into the fabric of her skin. And that, my friends, was only the beginning. It is a strange thing to be interrupted not by chaos, but by procedure. And strangers still realize that in America, for some of us, procedure has always been the velvet glove that hides the steel blade. Danielle Johnson stood still as Officer Daniels finished rifling through her belongings. He did not find a weapon, nor contraband, nor any reason to detain her, but he did find, as men like him often do, the need to linger. To make her wait. To make her earn what she had already paid for. "You work for the airline?" he asked, in a tone that sounded more like disbelief than inquiry. "Yes," she replied, voice even. "I'm a vice president with Delta. Marketing and branding." He blinked, smiled faintly, but it was the smile of a man who could not quite reconcile what he saw with what he believed. Not because Danielle lied, but because the world he was raised in did. "Mind if I radio that in?" he said, already reaching for his shoulder mic. And there it was again, not fear, not yet. But the pause, that slow, heavy pause in a black woman's chest when she realizes she's about to be delayed, questioned, or corrected, not by reason, but by the simple sin of existing where she isn't expected to be. The gate agent, a young white woman in her late 20s, glanced nervously over. She had seen the exchange. She had seen it. And yet, she said nothing. Because this is how the system protects itself. Not through violence, always, but through silence. Through complicity. Through the passive agreement of those who don't want to get involved. "Go ahead," Danielle said quietly. "Call whoever you need." Behind her, a couple in golf polos and sun hats watched with puzzled expressions. A middle-aged man 3 rows back leaned in toward his wife and muttered something about people playing the race card these days. She heard it. Of course she did. Black people always hear it, even when it's whispered. Especially when it's whispered. The call took less than 2 minutes. But in that short span of time, the line of passengers grew impatient. Some stepped to the side. Others checked their watches, their apps, their connections. But no one, not one, stepped forward to say, "This is wrong." Danielle thought of her father then. A man who once taught math at a high school that refused to give him tenure, not because he lacked credentials, but because he wasn't a cultural fit. He used to say, "They won't call you a liar, baby. They'll just keep asking questions until you stop talking." And here she was. Still answering. Still explaining. Still trying to make the truth palatable to a world that would rather swallow its own myths than accept hers. Officer Daniels received a reply in his earpiece. He nodded, gave a tight smile, and stepped back. "You check out." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "I always did." He ignored the comment. "You're good to board now." But what does it mean to be good in a world that doubts your goodness by default? What does it mean to be cleared in a system that never should have flagged you to begin with? She walked forward slowly, feeling the heat of eyes on her back. She could feel their questions, unspoken but loud. What did she do? What was she hiding? And deeper still, buried beneath all that, how dare she walk through here so sure of herself? As she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, the woman gave her a brittle smile. "Thank you for your patience." Danielle stared back. Patience is expensive. She stepped onto the jetway, the overhead lights humming low and soft. But the story would not end here. No, it had only just begun. Because in this country, where the rules are written in ink but enforced by assumption, a black woman in first class is still considered a threat, not because of what she carries, but because of who she is. And the higher she rises, the more the system aches to pull her down. Quietly, politely, procedurally. By the time Danielle settled into seat 3A, the world had resumed its performance of normalcy. The cabin air was cool, the steward's voice rehearsed, and her complimentary drink, still untouched, sat trembling slightly in its plastic glass. But underneath it all was the quiet hum of something far older than jet engines, discomfort wrapped in decorum. The man seated beside her was dressed in the kind of casual wealth that never has to speak its price. A linen blazer, navy slacks, boat shoes with no socks. He smiled as she sat down, but his smile was a study in restraint, like a man who had learned to keep his judgments tucked beneath a veneer of civility. "Business or pleasure?" he asked. Danielle turned her head slowly. "Excuse me." He gestured toward her laptop case. "Just curious." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "You don't look like most of the folks I see up here." And there it was, not a slur, not a snarl, but a subtle blade. A quiet rebuke disguised as conversation. It was always this way. The racial violence of their generation wore uniforms and carried batons. But in hers? It wore polo shirts. It offered mints. It asked questions with answers already in mind. "I'm a vice president," she said flatly, opening her laptop. "Oh," he replied, eyebrows raised. "Well, good for you. You must have worked pretty hard to get there." Danielle did not reply, because she knew that tone. She had heard it since she was a girl in honors classes filled with students whose last names came with legacy and whose futures had already been assigned the word inevitable. The implication was always the same: you're here because someone made an exception. The flight began to taxi. The steward announced their route. A young mother across the aisle soothed a crying child. But none of it softened the silence between Danielle and the man beside her. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Danielle had rewritten every chapter of her life just to sit in this seat. She'd bitten her tongue in boardrooms, smiled through smirks in meetings, and spent 10 years proving she wasn't an attitude problem, but a professional. And now, when she should have been basking in her success, she found herself shrinking under the invisible weight of other people's disbelief. Halfway through the flight, the man leaned in again. "Hope you don't take offense. Just don't see many folks like you flying this route." Danielle closed her laptop. "Sir," she said softly, "what offends me isn't your surprise. It's the assumption that I should be surprised to be here too." He blinked, looked away, adjusted his cuffs. The steward passed by with a tray of snacks. Danielle declined. The clouds outside the window shifted gently, casting shadows over the wing. And she thought, this is how it works. Not through hatred, but through habit. Not through laws, but through looks. These men, well-fed, well-schooled, well-meaning, would never call themselves bigots. They would donate to museums, attend diversity panels, even marry women who watched The Help and cried. But still, they would ask their questions. Still, they would doubt. Danielle reached for her bracelet, her grandmother's. The one she always wore on days when the world felt tight around her skin. Her grandmother, who had scrubbed hotel floors while white guests left notes about colored linens. Who never sat in first class but dreamed that one day her granddaughter might. Now here Danielle sat. Not because she was invited. Not because she was expecting. But because she came anyway. And though the seat was hers, the space around it still did not feel safe. Not yet. Not today. But she stayed. And that too, in a country like this, is an act of resistance. The seatbelt light dimmed. The plane hummed along its westward path, cutting through clouds like a blade through linen. And still, Danielle could not shake the feeling that her very presence here, in this air, in this space, was treated as a provocation. She glanced around the first-class cabin. 12 seats. 11 white faces. One exception. It wasn't just the man beside her anymore. It was the flight attendant who skipped her row 3 times before offering a drink. It was the couple 2 seats ahead who craned their necks just long enough to register her face, then whispered something between them and chuckled, their laughter muffled behind champagne flutes. And it was the silence of the others. The ones who said nothing. The ones who always say nothing. She knew this flight pattern well, not the physical one, but the social one. It started with the questioning eyes, moved into polite suspicion, and then took its most dangerous turn, quiet resentment, the kind that coils itself around every act of service like a snake waiting for an excuse to strike. Danielle pressed the call button. The attendant, a blonde woman with the kind of smile that only moved her lips, never her eyes, appeared. "Yes," she asked, coolly. "Could I get a ginger ale, please?" Danielle asked, evenly. The attendant blinked, hesitated just a second too long, then nodded. "Sure." She returned 2 minutes later with a can, unopened, and no cup. Danielle accepted it. She was used to being offered less. She reached for her phone, opened her notes app, and typed a simple line. "The air up here is no freer than the ground below." Behind her, a baby cried. Somewhere up front, a man coughed into his sleeve. But around her, the atmosphere remained sealed tight with an invisible pressure, the pressure of unacknowledged bias, wrapped in civility, delivered with a smile. Danielle had once believed, as so many are taught to believe, that success would insulate her. Those degrees, titles, and frequent flyer miles would serve as armor. But the truth, America's stubborn truth, was this: no black woman ever outruns the question of why she's there. Her thoughts were interrupted by another call bell. The attendant rushed past Danielle to tend to an older white man across the aisle. As Danielle watched the woman kneel beside him with soft concern, her voice light and caring, she could not help but feel the sting of contrast. It wasn't that she needed to be fawned over. It was that she wanted, just once, to be treated as normal. And here lay the paradox. She had done everything this country told her to do, worked hard, followed the rules, played the game. But now, even at 30,000 feet, the game was still rigged. Not against criminals, not against incompetence, but against visibility. Because the truth is, America doesn't mind a black woman's excellence, so long as she does it quietly. So long as she doesn't sit too close to the front. So long as she doesn't remind the others how little they had to do to get the same seat. Danielle stared out the window. The clouds looked like cities, white, soft, sprawling. And yet, down below, she knew the cities were real. Hard. Segregated. Stratified. Broken. This flight was not an escape. It was exposure. Because when a black woman sits in first class, she is not simply a passenger. She becomes a mirror, reflecting back to the nation what it most fears. The idea that her presence is not an exception, but a sign of what should have been possible all along. Danielle exhaled. She had 4 more hours in the air. 4 more hours of looks, of whispers, of pretending not to notice what she could feel in her bones. But she wasn't going anywhere. Let them squirm. Let them wonder. She wasn't leaving the seat she earned. Not for comfort. Not for peace. Not for them. The turbulence began not in the clouds, but in the cabin. It was subtle at first, like most betrayals. A pause in the drink service. A whisper between crew. A steward who passed Danielle's row for the 3rd time with no acknowledgement. Her ginger ale now warm in her hand, untouched, unopened, like a promise never kept. She didn't flinch. Not outwardly. She'd long ago learned the art of stillness, how to keep your spine straight while the world around you bends with prejudice. But this time, the silence wasn't quiet. It buzzed. It swelled. The man in the blazer beside her had shifted his posture slightly. Not out of discomfort, but out of disdain, a casual leaning away, as if proximity itself had become a burden. "You know," he said, not looking at her, "I was just reading an article the other day. Said there's a rise in people faking credentials to get perks like this." Danielle turned her head, slow as thunder. "And what does that have to do with me?" she asked, voice low and clear. He shrugged, eyes fixed on the seatback screen. "Just saying. Some folks really know how to work the system." There it was. The implication that being here, being her, required trickery. She wanted to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so expected. The American suspicion of the black traveler. That silent interrogation with no warrant. That unspoken audit of legitimacy. The irony? Danielle had paid for this ticket herself. No upgrades, no vouchers. Just earned miles and hard-won promotions. She had spent a decade building her career in rooms where she was the only one who looked like her. She'd learned the right diction, the right threads, the right tone of voice to quiet white discomfort. And still, the jury was always in session. "Maybe," she said, her words measured like a surgeon's incision, "you should read another article." He chuckled, but it was brittle. "Didn't mean to offend you." "No," she said. "You meant to remind me." He looked at her then, unsure if he should feel proud or ashamed. But she didn't look back. She returned her gaze to the window, where the sun hovered on the horizon, gold and unbothered. Minutes passed. The crew announced a delay in landing due to weather. Passengers shifted, murmured, sighed. Danielle closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. But peace, like justice, was fleeting. The real storm arrived when the flight attendant returned. "Miss," she said, tight-lipped, avoiding eye contact. Danielle raised an eyebrow. "There's been an issue," the woman said. "We've received a message from the ground. We need to verify your identification again before landing." Danielle blinked. "You what?" "It's just protocol," the woman said quickly. "We apologize for the inconvenience." "Inconvenience?" Danielle repeated. "I showed my ID at check-in. I went through the TSA. I'm sitting in my assigned seat. What's the issue?" The attendant glanced at the man beside her, of course she did, and then said, "We received a report of a mismatch in the system." Danielle inhaled. Deep. Controlled. And then she laughed. Not loud, but long enough to make the moment uncomfortable. "This is not a mismatch," she said, her voice slicing through the hush like piano wire. "This is a presumption. A pre-written story where I'm always the suspect." The stewardess hesitated. The man beside Danielle sat very still, suddenly regretting every word he'd said. Passengers began to notice. Eyes peeled between seats. Danielle pulled out her license. Her company badge. Her boarding pass. She laid them on the tray table like evidence in a trial where the verdict had already been decided. The stewardess took them, flustered. Danielle folded her hands. She would not cry. She would not plead. Let them squirm in the seat of their own guilt. As the documents were taken to the front of the plane, Danielle sat in silence. Not submission, but resistance. Because she knew that this wasn't about her ID. It was about her presence. The unspoken belief that a black woman in first class must always be one mistake away from being removed. She remembered something her grandmother once said, "You can dress your skin in silk, baby, but the world still sees the scar." Outside, the plane dipped slightly. The lights flickered. And Danielle, sitting still in seat 3A, felt the tremble of truth ripple through the cabin. It wasn't the weather making this flight unsteady. It was the weight of a lie too many Americans were still willing to believe. They say the airport is a place of transit, a nowhere that promises everywhere. But for Danielle, it became the place where truth lost its luggage and prejudice came pre-tagged. By the time the wheels touched down and the passengers exhaled with the relief of safe arrival, Danielle remained still, no sigh, no stretch. Just silence. Like a woman preparing to be summoned to the witness stand in her own life. The flight crew returned her documents with brittle politeness. "All clear," they mumbled, without eye contact. She took her things wordlessly. The stewardess tried to smile, but it came out crooked, like a sign that had been knocked loose in a storm. When Danielle stepped off the plane, it was not onto the tarmac of home, but into the next battle. A man in a pressed blazer and a stiff badge waited by the gate. He held a tablet. Didn't say welcome. Didn't say ma'am. Just motioned toward a side hallway. Ms. Ellis. Yes. Please come with me. No reason given. No explanation offered. Just the same polite menace of bureaucracy that black folks know too well. Politeness becomes a shield behind which racism sharpens its blade. She was led down a sterile corridor to a windowless room that smelled faintly of Lysol and distrust. A second officer entered, a woman, younger, with sharp eyes and a soft voice. Do you mind answering a few questions, Ms. Ellis? Danielle raised an eyebrow. Do I have a choice? The woman hesitated. Of course. You're not under arrest. Not under arrest. Just contained. Just separated. Just questioned for being. Danielle sighed. Her back was straight. Her face was unreadable. What's your destination today? Home. And you were in New York for what reason? Business. Can you specify? She gave the name of her company. The deal she'd closed. The event she'd spoken at. Every syllable was evidence. Every answer is a defensive maneuver. The woman nodded and tapped at her screen. We had a report of someone fitting your description behaving suspiciously at JFK. Danielle blinked once. What exactly was suspicious? My laptop? My presence in a first-class seat. The officer didn't answer. Couldn't. Because the truth had no bulletproof vest. And the real offense, once again, was that Danielle had dared to exist unapologetically in a space where she wasn't expected, or worse, where her presence was considered a mistake. Outside the room, the airport buzzed on. Laughter rolling suitcases, intercoms calling families to gates. And inside this room, a woman being asked to prove, once again, that she belonged. The female officer's tone softened. I believe this may have been a mix-up. We're just verifying. Danielle leaned forward. Her voice is calm but cutting. No. What you're doing is hiding behind language. You call it verification. I call it interrogation. You call it a system glitch. I call it history, because this isn't new. This is not a mix-up. It's a pattern. It's a habit dressed up in protocol. The officer looked away. Danielle continued. Have you ever asked a white man in a suit to explain his business travel? Have you ever pulled a white woman into a room to ask her why she flies first class? Or is it only people like me who need to justify our presence? The officer stood. Quietly. She left the room. Danielle waited. Time moved like honey on a cold spoon. She thought about her mother, who'd once told her, every room you enter, bring your dignity with you. Because some people will try to take it without ever raising their voice. Minutes passed before the door opened again. This time, it wasn't an officer. It was a man in a tailored suit. A Delta representative. Young, pale, nervous. Ms. Ellis, he said, clearing his throat. On behalf of Delta, I'd like to apologize. There was a mistaken report. You're free to go. We've also arranged transportation to your destination, complimentary of course. She stared at him, then slowly stood. No car can drive me out of what just happened, she said. And no apology can erase it. He nodded, unsure of what to say. He handed her a card. If you need anything. Danielle took the card but said nothing. As she exited the room and stepped back into the stream of moving people, her heels echoed on the polished floor like punctuation. She wasn't angry in the way they wanted her to be. She was composed. But beneath that calm was fire, a slow, righteous burn. Because what happened to her wasn't about her alone. It was about the hidden architecture of suspicion built into the bones of this country. A structure so old, so well-maintained, that even those operating it don't recognize the bricks. And Danielle knew. This wasn't the end. It was only chapter 6. And the weight of being black in America, especially while merely existing in spaces built to exclude, was the storm always waiting behind a smiling face. There comes a moment, not in courts, not on stages, but in mirror rooms, where the nation is forced to see itself naked and shivering. Stripped of its myths. And that moment, for Danielle, arrived the following morning. She had not slept. Not really. Rest does not come easy to the falsely accused. The body may be still, but the soul remains alert, waiting for the next uniform, the next interrogation disguised as a smile. Her phone vibrated just after dawn. An unfamiliar number. She let it ring. Then it rang again. And this time, she answered. "Ms. Ellis," said the voice on the other end. "Male. Measured. Corporate. This is Kenneth Riley, president of Delta Airlines. I was made aware of what happened yesterday. I'd like to apologize directly and, if possible, speak with you about a resolution." Danielle was silent for a long beat. Then, evenly, "I assume your company has lawyers. Has your legal team reviewed what happened, Mr. Riley?" A pause. "They have. And while the TSA is technically responsible for the escalation, our staff failed to intervene. That failure is ours. And it's inexcusable." That word hung there. Inexcusable. Not regrettable. Not unfortunate. Inexcusable. The difference mattered. Danielle agreed to meet. They flew her to Atlanta that afternoon. First class. Chauffeured car. But all the champagne and soft leather in the world could not dull the bruise beneath her ribs, the ache of knowing that her dignity was still something this nation considered conditional. At Delta's headquarters, she was greeted not with condescension, but with caution. As though they had realized too late that a quiet black woman could wield the kind of truth that doesn't beg for justice, but demands it. Mr. Riley was polite, but not performative. "Ms. Ellis," he said, "your story should never have happened. We are prepared to offer compensation, a public apology, and are drafting a new racial sensitivity initiative in partnership with outside consultants." Danielle listened. Took notes. Watched him the way a scholar watches a politician, measuring not just words, but what was left unsaid. "And what about the man who made the report?" she asked. "The one who decided I didn't belong in that seat on that plane?" Riley shifted in his chair. "He was another passenger. His identity is known. He was interviewed. He claimed he saw something unusual. He's been banned from flying with us again." Danielle nodded slowly. "That's convenient," she said. "But not enough. You're treating this like a blemish on your brand. I want you to treat it like what it is, a fracture in the American conscience." Riley blinked. "How do you suggest we do that?" She leaned forward. Calm. Cold. Certain. "You let me speak. Not behind closed doors. Not at your diversity luncheons. You let me speak to the public. You let me tell them what it feels like to be judged on sight while being polite. To be handcuffed for nothing while being brilliant. And you don't polish it. You don't edit it. You let me say it raw, because that's how it feels." He was quiet. And then, almost reverently, "All right." The town hall was scheduled within 72 hours. Internal staff. Flight crew. Executives. A video team. But more than anything, a mirror. And Danielle was the one holding it up. She stood at the front of a long, white room, facing rows of faces that rarely had to think about their own default innocence. And she spoke, not with rage, but with fire. "I wasn't pulled aside because of my behavior. I was pulled aside because of my existence. Because someone saw a black woman in a suit and decided that was an anomaly, not authority. And what you do with that information, how you hold your coworkers, your policies, your own beliefs accountable, is the real question now." Silence. Not stunned silence. Ashamed silence. And then, applause. Uneasy, but growing. Danielle did not bask in it. She left the building that day not as a symbol, but as a mirror breaker. Because when racism is polite, it's harder to fight. It does not wear a hood or carry a whip. It wears a uniform, a badge, a name tag. It offers apologies without change and courtesy without conscience. But Danielle's reflection, her truth, had cracked that politeness wide open. And now they had to look. There are stories we inherit, and then there are stories we become. Danielle Ellis had not asked for either. She had merely bought a ticket, packed a carry-on, and boarded a plane, believing, foolishly or not, that her competence would insulate her from suspicion. But America, for all its rhetoric of progress, still runs an invisible tally: who is believable and who is questioned. The aftermath of Danielle's public confrontation with Delta did not end in that conference room, nor in applause. No, the true test began after the spotlight dimmed, when the media moved on, when the executives went back to spreadsheets and sanitized memos. That is when the nation's conscience is laid bare, not during the outcry, but in the quiet afterward. Delta honored its promises. Some of them. The donation was issued. New employee training modules were introduced. Danielle's story was turned into a case study in corporate bias seminars. But like most systems built on hierarchy and habit, the deeper rut proved stubborn. Weeks after the incident, Danielle received an invitation to speak at a national civil rights conference in Chicago. It wasn't the first invitation, nor would it be the last. But this one came from elders, from men and women who had marched with Dr. King, who had bled on bridges, who had been spat on for daring to dream. They weren't seeking a keynote speaker. They were handing her a baton. She almost declined. But one evening, sitting in her modest apartment overlooking a world that still measured her by skin first and soul second, Danielle remembered what her grandmother used to say: "If they see you, baby, make them really look." So she went. The hall was packed, not with executives, but with people. Working people. Tired people. Black veterans of too many broken promises, and white allies searching for where their silence had become complicity. Danielle stood before them, not in a suit, but in the truth. "I was handcuffed," she began, "not because I posed a threat, but because someone thought I could. Thought I shouldn't be in first class. Thought I didn't fit." She paused. And that's the real danger of racism today. It doesn't always scream. It whispers. It suggests, "I doubt it." And it gives power to those doubts. The room leaned in. She spoke of algorithms that echo bias, of AI systems that flag darker faces more often, of job applications where Danielle Ellis gets callbacks, but D. Ellis, same resume, same degree, gets silence, of TSA lists built on vague reports, of gate agents who smile as they segregate, of the police who call it protocol, of judges who call it discretion, of neighbors who call it concern. She spoke of how even an apology, well-worded, well-funded, could become a shield to prevent real change if we let it. "You want to know what it felt like in that jetway?" she asked. "It felt like history reached out and grabbed my wrist. Not to guide me, but to remind me. That freedom in this country still has to be proven every time we show up." By the time she stepped down from that podium, the applause wasn't polite, it was raw. It was weary. And it was ready. A month later, Danielle's testimony was cited in a congressional hearing. 2 more airlines adopted Delta's revised passenger protocol. A TSA regional director was quietly removed. Small shifts. Not enough. But movement. She declined most of the interviews. Refused the labels. She was not anyone's poster child. But she did say yes to mentoring a young woman who had messaged her after the video went viral. A college student named Kiara, who had been profiled in a store and told she looked like trouble. Danielle met her for coffee. Listened. And when Kiara asked what she should do, Danielle said simply, "Tell your story. Even if they don't listen right away, tell them anyway." In the end, what happened at Gate B42 would become a ripple. But ripples matter. Enough of them can change the tide. Danielle went back to her job. She still flew often. Still wore her confidence like armor. But now, when she moved through terminals, people noticed. Not because of the scandal, but because of something quieter: respect. And when she boarded, she no longer looked away from the gate agents. She met their eyes. Every time. Because dignity, once stolen and reclaimed, becomes something no one can ever take again. And so we close not on justice completed, but on justice in motion. because that's the only way it ever exists. Not in verdicts, but in people like Danielle Ellis, who remind us, again and again, that what we tolerate in silence becomes the world our children inherit. And Lord help us, if they inherit the same.